Let me invite Pastor Tich to come. One thing, if you didn't know, Pastor Tich has actually studied African Christianity. Okay, so he's actually an expert on the subject, more than I am. And I want to involve him in this conversation. We're going to have an interview here, and it's going to be very interesting if you've never seen an interview in church instead of a sermon, or as an intro to a sermon. All right, so that would be good. We will also be deacons and carry things around as well. Okay, if you sit over there and I sit over here, then that side can see you more, this side can see me more. It's fair, okay? All right, good. I have 3 questions to ask Pastor Tich. Pastor Tich, by the way, what is your full name? You know, I tried to memorize it, and then I gave up. So just for the record.
You need to learn the heavenly language. But my full name is Tichawona Dzinotyiwei.
Okay. I can deal with Tichawona. I can sort of deal with that, and then the second one we'll just say it one more time. I'll give up on that one. My brother, I'm so thankful to have met you, and we've had a lot of conversations about Africa and about the gospel on this continent, and you and I share a common passion to see this continent really saturated with the gospel of the kingdom. I have 3 questions for you. Question number 1, Africans have always had their own ways to worship the supreme being. Now let me explain that a little bit. So those who have studied comparative religions of Africa, there's not one Africa traditional religion, but several, because every people group had their own way of expressing worship. But those that have studied what from now on, we will refer to as ATR, short form for Africa traditional religions, plural. But those who studied from BT to, and many others, including Kwame Bediako, someone you sat under. You know, sitting under Kwame is like Paul sitting under Gamaliel. But they have said that Africans, the commonality of ATRs is that they believed in a singular supreme being. Okay. Now, I don't know how many of you knew that. How many of you knew that Africans were not polytheistic? They believed in one singular being, all right? Okay, that comes as a surprise to some of you, but I would like you to go ahead and research some of that, and it's very interesting. Now, did the white missionaries ruin that? Did they? And this is a question that is asked all over. And by the way, on the continent, there's something called Afrocentrism. It's arising. This desire to be deeply African is coming. And so questions are being asked about the Christian faith, and this is one of the biggest. Is Christianity a white man's religion?
That was not in what I studied, so let me go. That's a very deep question, Pastor. People have written PhD theses on the basis of that question. And so, I'll try and respond with my thoughts in a very simplistic way, but hopefully in a way that kind of gets to the heart of the question. And I think, let me begin in the scriptures as a foundation for what I'd like to say. When we read in the Bible, in the book of Acts, the 17th chapter, I think it is, this is after the gospel has crossed the cultural frontier. In other words, the early apostles had now moved beyond just preaching to the Jews. They are now also preaching to the non-Jews, and particularly the Greeks. In Acts 17, we find a very interesting story where Paul gets to the city of Athens. In fact, he starts off in Thessalonica. There's some problems. He runs away. He's with Silas and Timothy, I think it is. They run away, they go to Berea, they are preaching there, they are making headway. The people of Thessalonica follow them to Berea, and then they have to evacuate Paul because these guys were out for his blood. And he ends up in this city called Athens. And so he says, in his mind, he's thinking, I'll wait for Silas and Timothy to join me. But as he's waiting for them, he starts walking around the city. And then the Bible says he notices that his heart was stirred within him because he notices that there were people who were given to religion, but then they were idol worshippers. And as he's walking around in the city, he comes across an inscription at one of the altars. And the inscription says, "To the unknown God." And so Paul just can't hold it anymore, and he starts preaching the gospel after that. To cut a long story short, he ends up before the philosophers of the city, and they ask him, can you explain to us, what is this new teaching that you are bringing to us here? And Paul does a very interesting but brilliant thing. He says to them, I've been walking around in your city and I can see you are religious people. I even saw that inscription, "To the unknown God." And this is the brilliance of Paul. He says, I have come to tell you about that unknown God. Now let's move to Africa. There's a deviation that happens when the gospel is preached in Africa. When the missionary movement that brought the gospel to Africa, or reintroduced the gospel to Africa, it came after some conferences that had been held.
Just quickly qualify reintroduce. That's an important word to us, and some people might miss it. Just explain why reintroduced is such an important word there. Yeah.
Well, I reintroduced to Africa because when Philip witnessed to the Ethiopian eunuch, that Ethiopian eunuch brought the gospel to Africa. And it goes to the heart of the question, is this a white man's religion? I think it's important for us to know that the gospel was in Africa before it reached Europe. And so when the modern missionary movement is kind of like reintroducing the gospel to Africa. Now, when they're reintroducing the gospel to Africa, there were conferences that were held in Europe. And the guiding thought, the main guiding thought of these conferences was the thought that said that Africans are what they called, the Latin phrase was a tabula rasa. And we say tabula rasa. That meant that there is nothing at all in the African's mind or consciousness that points to the existence or the reality of God. Now, if you juxtapose that with what you've just said, that Africans worshipped before.
In John Beatty's words, Africans, on the contrary, are deeply religious.
Deeply religious, yes. So the missionaries who brought the gospel here, that's the training that they went under. That you're going to a people who are a tabula rasa. There's nothing at all that points to divinity. And so the effect that had in their approach and their methods was that they demonized all things African. Right? And so when they arrived here, everything about Africa was demonized, including our names, by the way. That's why to this day, there are some government buildings or offices that you can go to, and I always find it funny, and you're filling out a form. I don't know if some of you have come across this experience, where it says name. Then below that it says Christian name. What are you saying? It's my African name, not a Christian name. But it's coming from that kind of thinking, where all things African are demonized. And so in that sense, in the sense of them deviating from the method that Paul used in Athens, where he took their knowledge, which was, of course, marred by sin, because we are all fallen human beings, a knowledge which was imperfect. And he said, listen, you are talking about an unknown God. Let me tell you about this unknown God. When the missionaries came here, instead of saying to us, we know you talk about Unkulunkulu. We know you talk about Modimu. We know you talk about Onyame. We know you talk about Mwari. We've come to tell you about him. Because there are things
Mulungu
that you do.
And Nyasaye for the Kenyans,
Yes.
and Guy.
Exactly. Because there were things that we didn't know about the supreme being we were worshiping. And one of the critical things that we didn't know is that this supreme being has a son. And his son is called Jesus Christ. Enter the gospel. You know, and so when they did not build on that knowledge that was there, and said, in order for you to be a Christian, you have to completely dismiss and disregard what you have always known and almost be introduced to this new God that you've never known. In that sense, I would say it was unfortunate. It was really unfortunate. Be that as it may, I think that the fact that we have a Christian presence and witness in Africa today, the fact that the church is here today, the fact that we are gathered as OBC, as Christians in Africa today, is testament to the fact that it doesn't matter how inadequate the way they communicated the gospel was. It does not nullify that the gospel was authentically communicated. We are evidence of that. You see, human beings in this realm, we have a problem in that we are imperfect. Everything we do, imperfection is built into it. You know, so the imperfections of the missionary movement do not nullify the authenticity of the missionary movement.
I love it. I love it. So much like treasure in jars of clay, in the sense that the gospel is almost always carried by imperfect containers.
Yes.
And but the gospel will stand for its own, you know, will stand the test of time, because if you look at America and slavery, the fact that you still have African Americans who are believers in Jesus tells you they can see that their masters enslaved them and the slavery was wrong. But this Jesus, we will keep him. We will continue to believe in this Jesus, right? So that's fantastic. A quick mention here that is helpful to think through. Some of you, God might call to go to a different culture to take the gospel. There's a missiologist. His name is Michael Cooper. And he calls what you've described there with Paul, he calls that one theological missiocentrism, which means anywhere you go into a new culture, start with God. Start with the fact that God has already been there before you arrived there. And then discover how God has been working in that culture, and then use what God has already put in store for you there and just use it the same way Paul is using the unknown God idea.
And I think there's biblical evidence for that, Pastor. I think it's Acts 14 where Paul and Silas talk about God has not left himself without a witness in every culture.
In every culture. That's so important to remember. All right, good. Let me try and move on. I really wish we could dive on that one more because it's so important. But let me just say it. I'm tempted, and this is good because it's going on record. It might help some of my students elsewhere too. Let me just mention quickly. So, for example, the Bible is written in Hebrew in the Old Testament. It is also written in Greek in the New Testament. And God uses a lot of the things, even within Greek religion, to help Bible writers communicate deep biblical truths. For example, the big one, John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. We love that one. And you've heard pastors say, that is the word logos, right? And we take it for granted that the word logos means what it means. But the one who came up with that was a guy called Heraclitus, who talked about logos 4th century BC, before Christ, 400 years before Christ was born. A guy introduced this idea of Logos, which is this essence of all things, right? And then John comes and he wants to write about Jesus, and it's like, now, how can I describe Jesus? Logos. That word already existed. John did not make it up. God went before John hundreds of years to use Heraclitus to come up with the word Logos to make it better to talk about Jesus. Do you understand this? Anyway, it's good. All right, here's another one. What are some other obstacles that Africans face that hinder Africans from receiving and believing the gospel today?
Today I think it would be the misrepresentation of the gospel. The gospel is the good news of God's love that is expressed by his giving. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And one of the biggest obstacles that we have today is there is now a proliferation of a gospel of taking as opposed to giving. And it's taking for the benefit of the few. Taking even for those who don't have anything. For the benefit of the few. That's one of the things that I think is a hindrance. But also, this whole concept, I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase that the church in Africa is 1,000 miles wide, but an inch deep. In the sense that we have not taken time as Africans to actually formulate our theology. Remember, the Bible says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And so there's a theologian who has said that you can argue with him or agree with him, but he says that part of the problem in Africa is that Jesus Christ has been presented as the answer to questions that white people would ask, as the solution to problems that a European would face. And he says, but if Christ were to be presented as the answer to problems that Africans are facing, what would he look like? Right? And that's a deep question, because sometimes we just end up castigating Christians and saying, hey, you're a Christian, how can you be in church today and then visiting the witch doctor tomorrow? And part of the reason is because it could be that the gospel that is being preached in church is ignoring some of the, or is not speaking to, let me put it that way, it's not speaking to some of the deeply African issues that the person is grappling with. And so to look for solutions to those questions, let me go to those who will take me seriously and will not dismiss this as superstition. Because a lot of times what we dismiss as superstition is the way evil manifests in our context. Evil manifests differently in different contexts. And so the way evil manifests in our context, again, because of the tabula rasa philosophy, we just dismiss this as, no, that's superstition, that's imagination, that's all in your head. And so that's also becoming a hindrance. So we need to do our own thinking and theologizing.
Has it occurred to you that as a result, Africans have brought witch doctors to the church?
Absolutely.
So now witch doctors are in the church, doing the same thing that we used to do out there, because now in the church, we can still give you water, salt, a handkerchief, stones. For money that you pay money, and then we give you all these items. We go around you, we do all these rituals. It's still witch doctors in church, right?
Church,
yes. And that's...
We'll bewitch you in the name of Christ.
Basically, bewitching, it's a terrible thing. Now, in connection to that and any other obstacles that may arise, and this is the last question, but the Pew Research has it that by 2060, 40% of Christians in the world will call Africa home, meaning the majority of Christians in the world will be based in Africa by 2060. Okay. Now, when I hear that, I want to feel like it's good news, like, oh, it will be our time, But at the same time, it's a scary thing, because if we stand before Jesus one day and be asked, when it was your time to influence Christianity, but the center of Christianity changes, by the way, every, so many years. Now it's coming to Africa. And if we stand before Jesus and Jesus asks, when it was your time, were you faithful, right? And we want to be faithful. And that's why in my own contribution, I want to travel around Africa and have this conversation all over Africa. And in your view, how should the African church best prepare for that season?
Oh, again, this was not in the course that I covered. I think one of the things that we need to do is something that is beautifully simple and yet deeply profound. Okay. And that is to reread the Great Commission. See, when the Great Commission says, go into the world and make disciples of nations, right? Baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. What we hear or what we read is going to the nations and pluck out individuals and make them disciples. But there's more to nationhood. There's more to things that compose a nation than just the individuals. The governance, the culture, the education, there's a whole host of things that comprises nationhood. In fact, we are meeting under the theme redemption. I think one of the best examples of how nations have been redeemed is ironically when the gospel was preached in Europe. Because redemption does not mean necessarily replacing something new, something old with something new. It means taking what is already there and is being misused, and you turn it, you reorient it so that it can be used properly. That's part of why we're celebrating Easter. And I know some people are battling with this question, where does this Easter come from? Well, it's not in the Bible, that's the truth. It was a pagan holiday where they worshipped the goddess Esther, who was the goddess of fertility, which is why you get Easter bunnies and Easter eggs and all of that. So what happened there? They went into the nation and brought everything about the nation. They gave it
new meaning.
And they redeemed
culture.
What was being used to worship idols, what was being used to worship the devil. They redeemed that. Did not throw it away. They turned it around and say, let's use it to worship God. And so I think that's what needs to happen in Africa, is just to rethink and reread the Great Commission.
Pastor Tich, everybody, give him a big hand. It's awesome, awesome. Wow. So refreshing. So refreshing. And that last part there is something interesting, because redeeming culture is something even we Africans should do, and others are doing that well. Circumcision events are being used to disciple boys, right? We have during marriage blessing, and we used to do it a certain type of way, but the blessing is still being done, and it's being done redemptively, right? There's still many things, even the giving of dowry. There's a way to do that well, to make Jesus at the center of that, and not to make it just like a financial deal, And so there's many ways to redeem culture, but man, I just really, really appreciate the things my brother had to say there.